Hey everybody, this video is called Hezekiah Rules Under Assyria's Threat, and tonight we continue our pass-through study here in the book of 2 Kings, looking at the 18th chapter, where we're going to look at King Hezekiah's reign under the threat of Assyria. And so chapter 18, starting verse 1 and 2, says, "Now it came to pass in the 3rd year of Hosea, the son of Elah, king of Israel, that Hezekiah, the son of Ahaz, king of Judah, began to reign. He was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned for 29 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Abi, the daughter of Zechariah, and he did what was right in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his father David had done." So I know I just read one extra verse, 1 through 3 here. But we kick off here the last major division of the books of Kings, 1 Kings and 2 Kings. And it's going to be narrating the events here in the surviving southern kingdom of Judah from 722 until its captivity and destruction in 586 BC. And we'll see the accounts here of the two good kings given of Hezekiah and Josiah. And however, their reforms, their rules, they don't reverse the effects of what happens when you have two bad kings, Ahaz and Manasseh. And the books of Kings began in chapter 5 of 1 Kings with the building of the temple. And we're going to see here, as we wrap up our study in the next few weeks, of the book ending with the destruction of the temple. And it's sad to see Israel go from establishing true worship and end up falling into the destruction through apostasy. And the 3rd year, speaking of, is 729 BC. And Hosea began to reign in 732 BC. And Hezekiah, he was co-regent with Ahaz to 715 BC. And in verse 2, we see 29 years, which would be from 715 to 686 BC. And Hezekiah reigned by himself for 20 years between 715 and 695 BC, with his son Manasseh for 9 years in 695 to 686 BC. And the 29 years reign that is given here indicates only those years after his co-regency with Ahaz was over, and when he was the actual sovereign king. And during Hezekiah's reign, the prophets Isaiah and Micah, they continue to minister in Judah. And Hezekiah saw firsthand of what happened when the people of God rejected him and his word and worshiped other gods from the northern kingdom. And Hezekiah, he had a long and mostly blessed reign, unlike many of the other kings that we have gotten to be introduced to. To continue here, verse 3 through 6, it says, "And he did what was right in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his father David had done. He removed the high places and broke the sacred pillars, cut down the wooden image, and broke in pieces the bronze serpent that Moses had made, for until the days of the children of Israel burned incense to it and called it Nehushtan. He trusted in the Lord God of Israel, so that after him was none like him among all the kings of Judah, nor who were before him. For he held fast to the Lord. He did not depart from following him, but kept his commandments, which the Lord had commanded Moses." So verses 3 through 6 here, we see that Hezekiah was one of the most zealous, one of the most motivated reformers of Judah, prohibiting the worship on the high places that were prohibited by the Mosaic law in Deuteronomy chapter 12. So we see that Hezekiah honored God's law in that regard. And we see that Hezekiah went beyond that. He destroyed the idols that were used in the worship of these false Canaanite gods like Baal and Ashtoreth, or Asherah. In Hezekiah, we see that he broke the Nehushtan in the pieces, which was the bronze snake that Moses made back in the wilderness, as we saw back in Numbers chapter 21, verse 4 through 9, because Judah had come to the point where they worshipped this as an idol, and it was influenced by their Canaanite religion, which regarded snakes as fertility symbols. And the most notable quality of King Hezekiah was that he relied on the Lord as his hope in every situation. And as we'll be coming up to in verse 17 through the rest of this chapter, we see that he's going to trust in the Lord during a severe national crisis. And during troublesome events, we see that he clings to the Lord faithfully and following him and obeying his commands. And in verse 7, as a result, the Lord was with him and gave him success. As we read in verse 7 and 8, the Lord was with him, he prospered wherever he went, and he rebelled against the king of Assyria and did not serve him. He subdued the Philistines as far as Gaza and its territory, from watchtower to fortified city. So before Hezekiah became king, his father had submitted to Assyria, and courageously Hezekiah broke that control by Assyria and asserted independence. And in verse 8, we see that Gaza was the southernmost city of the Philistines, located approximately 55 miles southwest of Jerusalem. And since Assyria had controlled Philistia, Hezekiah's invasion defied Assyrian rule and brought the threat of retaliation. And in verse 9 through 12, it says, "Now it came to pass in the 4th year of King Hezekiah, which was the 7th year of Hosea, the son of Elah, king of Israel, that Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, came up against Samaria and besieged it. And at the end of the 3 years they took it. And in the 6th year of Hezekiah, that is, the 9th year of Hosea, king of Israel, Samaria was taken. Then the king of Assyria carried Israel away captive to Assyria, and put them in Halah, and by the Habor, the river of Gozan, in the cities of the Medes." In verse 12, "Because they did not obey the voice of the Lord their God, but transgressed his covenant, and all that Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded, that they would neither hear nor do them." So we see that these verses here flash back to a time just before Israel's destruction and captivity, to give a summary of the fall of Samaria as a graphic-like picture or reminder of the Assyrian power and the threat that was still to Judah. And my Apple Watch is going crazy, thinking I'm calling Siri, but, I'll preach to Siri later. But, I was going through verses 9 through 12 here, and I almost was like, did I read the wrong page again? So I've been known to do that. But, these verses are a reflection of what we covered in our last study. And this review sets the scene for the siege of Jerusalem, with its reminder of Israel's apostasy, against which Hezekiah's faith in the Lord was a bright contrast. And when Judah stopped hearing and doing the commandments of God, they would also face judgment. And we know from Deuteronomy 28 the promise that there would be blessings for obedience and cursings for disobedience. In verse 13 through 16 here says, "And in the 14th year of King Hezekiah, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and took them. The Hezekiah, king of Judah, sent to the king of Assyria at Lachish, saying, I have done wrong. Turn away from me, whatever you impose on me, and I will pay. And the king of Assyria assessed Hezekiah, king of Judah, 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. So Hezekiah gave him all of the silver that was found in the house of the Lord and the treasuries of the king's house. At that time Hezekiah stripped the gold from the doors of the temple of the Lord and from the pillars which Hezekiah, king of Judah, had overlaid, and gave it to the king of Assyria. So we see that the 14th year would have been 701 BC. And we see that Hezekiah began his sole reign or rule in 715 BC. And this date for the siege of Jerusalem is confirmed in the Assyrian forces. And Sennacherib succeeded Sargon II as king of Assyria in 705 BC, and he would go on to rule until about 681 BC. And Hezekiah had rebelled against him, probably by withholding tribute when he invaded the Philistia. And Hezekiah sought to rectify the situation with Sennacherib by confessing his error and rebellion and paying tribute to the Assyrian king demanded. And the Assyrian king asked for 11 tons of silver and ton of gold. And to pay, Hezekiah went to empty the temple and palace treasures, and he stripped the layers of gold off the doors and the doorposts of this temple. And Lachish is important to historians and archaeologists as an important fortress city of Judah, 30 miles southwest of Jerusalem. And archaeologists have discovered a pit there with thousands of remains believed to be the result of King Nebuchadnezzar, who we'll hear more of in the book of Daniel, more than 100 years after the attack on the Assyrians. And to continue along here, verse 17 through 20 says, Then the king of Assyria sent the Tartan, the Rabsaris, and the Rabshakeh from Lachish with a great army against Jerusalem to King Hezekiah. And then they went up and came out to Jerusalem. And when they had come up, they went and stood by the aqueduct from the upper pool, which was on the highway to Fuller's Field. And when they had called to the king, Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, who was over the household, Shebna, the scribe, and Joah, the son of Asaph, the recorder, came out to them. Then the Rabshakeh said to them, Say now to Hezekiah, Thus says the Lord, the great king, thus says the great king, the king of Assyria. What confidence is this in which you trust? You speak of having places and powers for war, but they are mere words. In whom do you trust, that you rebel against me? So, verse 17 and 20 here, Tartan would have been the general of the Assyrian army as seen in Isaiah chapter 20, verse 1. And Rabsaris was the high official in the palace, and Rabshakeh meant commander, and he was the spokesperson for King Sennacherib, who represented the king against Jerusalem on this occasion. And Sennacherib's conquest of Lachish was at its closing phase when he sent to the messengers. And Sennacherib hoped to bluff Judah into submitting through his great army. And the aqueduct from the upper pool was likely located on higher ground northwest of Jerusalem on the main north-south highway between Judah and Samaria. And in the book of Isaiah chapter 7 verse 3, Isaiah the prophet met Ahaz at the spot to try to persuade him not to trust in the foreign powers. In Fuller's, it means launderer, and it indicates that the field was where there was such activity was done near the water supply. And Eliakim was the palace administrator, and Shebna was the secretary. And the recorder, you might see it in other places across the Old Testament, it was the position in which there was the mediator between the king and the people. And the Rabshakeh's logic was that Egypt would be unable to deliver Jerusalem. And the great king in verse 19 was a self-appropriated title for the Assyrian kings. And in contrast, the Rabshakeh rudely omitted any title for Hezekiah. And in verse 20, the implication was that Assyria was so strong that there was none stronger. And to continue here, verse 21 through 25 says, "Now look, you are trusting in the staff of the broken-kneed, Egypt on which the man leans. It will go into the hand and pierce it. So Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to all who trust in him. But if you say to me, we trust in the Lord our God, is it not he whose high places and whose altars Hezekiah has taken away, and said to Judah and Jerusalem, you shall worship before the altar in Jerusalem? Now therefore I urge you, give a pledge to my master, the king of Assyria, and I will give you 2,000 horses, if you are able on your part to put riders on them. How then will you repel one captain of the least of my master's servants, and put your trust in Egypt for chariots and horsemen? Have I now come up without the Lord against this place to destroy it? The Lord said to me, go up against this land and destroy it." So verses 21 through 25 here, we look at Rabshakeh's logic also was the Lord had called on the Assyrians to destroy Judah. And the Assyrians' advice strongly resembled that of Isaiah as seen in Isaiah across the book of Isaiah. And so some references you may want to look up is Isaiah chapter 19, verse 14 through 16, Isaiah chapter 30, verse 7, and Isaiah 31, verse 3, just for a few of them. And Egypt was not strong and could not be counted on for help. And the Rabshakeh mistakenly thought that Hezekiah's reforms in removing the idols from all over the land and reestablishing central worship in Jerusalem had removed opportunities to worship the Lord, and therefore cut back on honoring Judah's God, thereby displeasing him and forfeiting his help in war. And that all worship center in Solomon's temple was utterly foreign to the polytheistic Assyrians. And Rabshakeh's strategy was to make Judah give up. That's what their purpose was. And it sounds like our enemy who desires that you give up. And Rabshakeh mocked Judah's weak army. And he essentially says that we are better than you, and you know it, and can beat you with our hands behind our backs. You know, is pretty much a smack talker. And God told me to destroy you. You know, essentially, we see from Isaiah chapter 7, verse 16 and 17, Isaiah chapter 8, verse 3 and 4, that it was prophesied that this would happen and that God allowed it as it was the will of God. However, God did not tempt the Assyrians. It was the desire of their own hearts, and God allowed them to carry out what their corrupt desires were. And verse 26-27 says, Then Eliakim the son of Hilkiah, Shebna, and Joah said to Rabshakeh, Please speak to your servants in Aramaic, for we understand it, and do not speak to us in Hebrew, in the hearing of the people who are on the wall. But the Rabshakeh said to them, Has my master sent me to your master, and to you to speak these words, and not to the men who sit on the wall, who will eat and drink their own waste with you? So feel free to check out what Isaiah is saying back in Isaiah chapter 36. And the Rabshakeh did not care if the common citizens of Jerusalem could hear him, as it was one of the goals for more fear and discouragement and despair that he could spread. And the better he could, he liked. And he pointed to what conditions would be like in Jerusalem after an extended siege. And he wanted this to offend everyone and to frighten those who had heard it. And he wanted to magnify a sense of fear and discouragement and despair. In verse 28 through 35, says here, Then the Rabshakeh stood and called out with a loud voice in Hebrew, and spoke, saying, Hear the word of the great king, the king of Assyria. Thus says the king, Do not let Hezekiah deceive you, for he will not be able to deliver you from his hand, nor let Hezekiah make you trust in the Lord, saying that the Lord will surely deliver us. This city shall not be given into the hand of the king of Assyria. Do not listen to Hezekiah, for thus says the king of Assyria, Make peace with me, buy a present, and come out to me, and every one of you eat from his own vine, and every one from his own fig tree, and every one of you drink the waters of his own cistern, until I come and take you away to the land like your own land, a land of grain and new wine, a land of bread and vineyards, a land of olive groves and honey, that you may live and not die. But do not listen to Hezekiah, lest he persuade you, saying that the Lord will deliver us. Has any of the gods of the nations at all delivered its land from the hand of the king of Assyria? Where are the gods of Hamath and Arpad? Where are the gods of Sepharvaim and Hena and Iva? Indeed, have they delivered Samaria from my hand? Who among all the gods of the lands have delivered their countries from my hand, that the Lord deliver Jerusalem from my hand? So we see here, verse 28 through 35, that the Rabshakeh spoke longer and louder in Hebrew, suggestion that Hezekiah couldn't save the city, but that the great king of Assyria would fill the people with the abundance if they promised to surrender to the Assyrian king's sovereignty. And he called for them to give tribute to the king and to be willing to go into a rich and beneficial exile. And you could see Isaiah's account once again if you study the book of Isaiah chapter 36. And the Rabshakeh appealed to the people directly here. In verse 36-37, before this chapter wraps up, it says, But the people held their peace and answered him not with word, for the king's commandment was, Do not answer him. Then Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, who was over the household, Shebna the scribe, and Joah, the son of Asaph, the recorder, came to Hezekiah with their clothes torn and told him the words of the Rabshakeh. So verse 36 and 37 here, once again, feel free to check out the account given in Isaiah chapter 36. And the people did not try to argue with the Rabshakeh. And King Hezekiah was wise enough to command them to not answer him or the officials. And the people were wise enough to obey King Hezekiah. And though silent, it deeply affected them by this attack. And things were bad, but the battle was not yet lost. And I'm just going to put on my interior light, starting to get dark here for our wrap up.
Well, with that
all right, so the wrap up here, sorry there was a little delay in that. Didn't want to go on without me turning the accessory to the car, but the wrap up's going to be short, to the point. And so today's chapter, we look at Hezekiah reigning over Judah for 29 years in his righteousness, and we saw him break the bronze serpent that Moses made into pieces. And that made Moses made for the nation to be looked upon to be spared from snake bites, but we see that the people perverted it into an idol. And, the bronze serpent was to be a representation of the coming Messiah, Jesus Christ. And we'll see in John chapter 3, verse 14. John 3:14 and 15, it says, "And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so the Son of Man must be lifted up, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life." And so, one thing for us is we must be on guard that we don't fall into idolatry. We must be on guard as Christians that we don't fall into the idolatry of other leaders. And you can see many people put pastors on a pedestal. And we must also be careful that we don't put education as an idol into our life. And there's nothing wrong with learning and studying and growing in your knowledge every day, but don't make that your idol where you forget Christ. And we must guard ourselves against the idolatry of money. And we know from the book of 1 Timothy chapter 6 that the love of money is the root of all evil. And, we must be on guard at other things that can pull us away from Christ. And we looked also today at Hezekiah's political achievements. And we see that Israel fell into exile during his reign. And we saw Hezekiah tried to buy peace from the Assyrians. And we looked at the Rabshakeh tried to convince Judah to surrender. And we also looked at the demoralizing arguments of the Rabshakeh. And one thing that we must make note of is that the enemy is always going to seek the weakness in us. He wants you to give up. And I want to look at Luke chapter 4, verse 5. And you might remember this passage. Just like Matthew 4, this is the temptation of Jesus. So, Luke chapter 4, verse 5 through 8. And it says here, "Then the devil, taking him up on a high mountain, showed him all the kingdoms of the world in a moment of time. And the devil said to him, All this authority I will give you, and their glory, for this has been delivered to me, and I give it to whomever I wish. Therefore, if you will worship before me, all will be yours." In verse 8, "And Jesus answered him and said, Get behind me, Satan, for it is written, You shall worship the Lord your God, and him you only shall serve." So we see that Satan used this strategy against Jesus during his temptation of him in the wilderness. And Satan offered Jesus all the kingdoms of the world in exchange if Jesus would worship him. And it did not work for Jesus, and it should not work for us. We should be mindful. 1 Peter 5:7 says that the devil prowls like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. And we must ensure that we are clinging to Christ, and that we are close to God, and that we are not allowing our weakness to be taken where we give up. And we look at Hezekiah's men ask Rabshakeh to speak only to them. And we see Rabshakeh's appeal to the people directly. We see the chapter ending with the response of the officials and the people. And the people, they experience hardship. We see that in today's text. And I want to read some very encouraging verses here in the book of 2 Corinthians. And you might know these verses if you ever needed to be comforted. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 8 and 9 says, "We are hard pressed on every side, yet not crushed. We are perplexed, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not forsaken. And struck down, but not destroyed." So the people, they had the same experience as the Apostle Paul has later here in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 8 and 9, that things were not going to be easy. But that's going to wrap up today's video. We'll see you next on Saturday, as we're going to be looking at a topical message for the first time in about a month. So I know Saturday is April Fool's, and many people are going to love the Psalm chapter 14, verse 1, but I got my own video planned where we're going to talk about another type of fool that are professing believers. And it's going to be to examine yourself and all that. But I don't want to give you too many details, because Topical Saturday, you don't find out until Saturday morning with that. So I hope you have a great rest of your week. God bless, and we'll see you on Saturday.